Singapore's Prime Minister Loong is making the opening address at a high-level defence summit here in the city-state. The Shangri-La Dialogue brings together dozens of defence leaders who will, over the weekend, discuss global security issues. Mr. Lee's speech addresses the US-China rivalry, a relationship that's expected to dominate talks. Earlier in the speech, Mr. Lee set the context outlining China's rise from backwater economy to the world's second-largest one. Now this and its growing defense capabilities have put countries, including the United States, on edge. In fact, Mr. Lee believes that Washington will have to make the most difficult adjustment to this new dynamic. Now, over the weekend, both the US and China will sell their security aspirations for the region in plenary sessions. Acting US Defense Secretary Patrick Shanahan will share its Indo-Pacific strategy, and China's Defense Minister, General Wei Fenghe, will attempt to ease concerns about its military activities. Now, let's listen in.
The bottom line is that the US and China need to work together, and with other countries too, to bring the global system up to date and to not upend the system. To succeed in this, each must understand the other's point of view and reconcile the other's interests. Meanwhile, stresses and strains have built up between the two over multiple issues, including cyber espionage, 5G technology, freedom of navigation, human rights, and especially trade, where the two countries have reached an impasse. If both sides treat their trade dispute purely on its own merits, I have no doubt that trade negotiators who are highly competent will be able to resolve it. But if either side uses trade rules to keep the other down, or one side comes to the conclusion that the other is trying to do this, then the dispute will not be resolved, and the consequences will be far graver than a loss of GDP. The broader bilateral relationship will be contaminated. Other areas will inevitably be affected, including investments, technology, and people-to-people relations. Every action taken by one side will be seen as a direct challenge to the other and will elicit a counteraction. We will all be headed for a more divided and troubled world. Worryingly, this is starting to happen. Attitudes on both sides have been hardening. The US National Security Strategy and National Defense Strategy documents describe China as a revisionist power and America's strategic competitor. The recent presidential executive order on securing the information and communications technology and services supply chain states that it is aimed at, quote, foreign adversaries. It stopped just short of naming any particular country, but it made quite clear what actions the US intends to take. There's a growing bipartisan consensus in the US that China has taken advantage of the US for far too long, that China has overtaken or will soon overtake the US in areas of advanced technology, such as artificial intelligence and some aspects of military technology, through underhand means. That instead of opening up and becoming more like the US, China has regressed in terms of political openness and hence represents a challenge to American values and leadership. Americans now talk openly of containing China, and to do so soon before it is too late, the way they used to talk about the USSR and the Soviet bloc. This negative view of China has permeated the US establishment. It's not confined to the White House or the administration, but is shared widely by Congress, the military, the media, academics, and NGOs too. Those inclined to a more positive view of China have been marginalized. Even US business sentiment towards China has soured. American businesses used to be the strongest supporters of China because they benefited directly from China's growth and economic opportunities. They had strongly advocated China's accession to the WTO. When protectionist or nativist sentiments built up in the US, they were a balancing voice that counseled good relations with China. Now, that goodwill has all but evaporated. US businesses feel let down that China has not adjusted its policies on trade and investments, and in fact systematically disadvantages foreign businesses operating in China while Chinese businesses operate uninhibited in the US. They want greater access to the China market and not just to use China for their global supply chains. This loss of goodwill on the part of an important constituency is a serious problem for China, which the Chinese, I think, have not fully appreciated or dealt with. In China, views are hardening too. There are those who see the US as trying to thwart China's legitimate ambitions, convinced that no matter what they do or concede on individual issues, the US will never be satisfied. They are alarmed by talk of a clash of civilizations between the US and China. They reject what they see as efforts by the US to impose its political system and political values on China. This is coupled with a strong vein of nationalistic fervor. Chinese television is rebroadcasting old movies of the Korean War, which in Chinese is known as 抗美援朝战争, which means the war to resist America and assist North Korea. There's even a US trade war song circulating on the internet based on the theme music from a popular 1960s war movie about fighting the Japanese in the Sino-Japanese War. Hardly anyone in China, whether in government, academia, or the media, can be found who is prepared to speak up for a more positive and benign interpretation of the US intent. The fundamental problem between the US and China is a mutual lack of strategic trust. This bodes ill for any compromise or peaceful accommodation. But to go down the present path would be a serious mistake on both sides. There is no strategic inevitability about a US-China face-off. But at the same time, if such a face-off does happen, it will be nothing like the Cold War. First, there is no irreconcilable ideological divide between the US and China. China may be communist in political structure, but it has adopted market principles in many areas. The Soviets sought to overturn the world order, but China has benefited from and by and large worked within the framework of existing multilateral institutions. During the Cold War, the communist bloc sought to export communism to the world. But China today is not attempting to turn other countries communist. Indeed, it's often criticized for being too willing to do business with countries and leaders regardless of their reputation or standing, citing non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries. Second, China has extensive economic and trade links with the rest of the world. It is a major node in the world economy, unlike the USSR, whose economic links outside the Soviet bloc were negligible. In fact, all of the US's allies in Japan, in Asia, including Japan, the Philippines, South Korea, Thailand, Australia, as well as many of its friends and partners, including Singapore, have China as their largest trading partner. They are all allies of the United States, friends of the United States, but their largest trading partner is China. They all hope that the US and China will resolve their differences. They want to be friends with both, to nurture security and economic ties with the US as they grow their business links with China. In a new Cold War, there can be no clear division between friend and foe. nor is it possible to create a NATO or Warsaw Pact equivalent with a hard line drawn through Asia or drawn down the middle of the Pacific Ocean. On the other hand, if there is indeed a conflict between the US and China, where will it end? The Cold War ended with a total collapse of the sclerotic planned economies of the Soviet Union and the Eastern European countries, under the pressure of enormous defense spending, trying to match SDI, Star Wars. Even then, it took 40 years. It's highly improbable that the vigorous Chinese economy will collapse in the same way. China cannot take down the US either. The US is still by far the strongest country in the world. Its economy remains the most innovative and powerful, and its military capabilities far exceed anyone else's. Americans worry about China catching up with the US. But although China may be abreast or even ahead in some fields, it will be many years before China can equal the US. And contrary to what some people in China think, the US is not a declining power, nor is it withdrawing from the world. In fact, the US has made clear its intention to compete robustly, though in a different mode than before. Even short of outright conflict, a prolonged period of tension and uncertainty would be extremely damaging. Many serious international problems, like the Korean situation, nuclear non-proliferation, and climate change, cannot be tackled without the full participation of the US and China, together with other countries. In economic terms, the loss will not just be a percentage point or two of GDP, but the huge benefits of globalized markets and production chains, and the sharing of knowledge and breakthroughs that enable all countries to progress faster together. We should therefore do our utmost to avoid going down the path of conflict and causing enmity on both sides that will last for generations. Of course, it's a duty of security and defense establishments to think the unthinkable and plan for worst-case scenarios. But it's the responsibility of political leaders to find solutions to head off these extreme outcomes. And this is hard because both sides have leaders facing powerful domestic pressures. In the US, the political mood is deeply divided and disgruntled. Large segments of American society have lost confidence in globalization and multilateralism. According to a Pew survey last year, nearly half of all Americans have an unfavorable opinion of China. As the presidential elections approach, these attitudes will surely deepen, because neither the Republicans nor the Democrats will want to risk being accused of being soft on China. Regardless whether President Trump is re-elected or another Republican or Democrat wins, these sentiments will not go away. China may not have US-style presidential elections, but their leaders face strong internal pressures too. In fact, the orientation of the Chinese leadership is primarily domestic. They know they have major issues to deal with at home. These include unevenly distributed growth, significant rural poverty, an aging population, and rising expectations for a better quality of life. Both sides are sensitive about being perceived weak. Out of political necessity, the US wants to show that it has come out ahead in any deal. On the other side, because of China's long history with the West, its leaders cannot afford to appear to succumb to Western pressure to accept an unequal treaty. Just a few weeks ago, China commemorated the centennial of the May 4th movement. Not all of you may be familiar with it, but it is an important date in modern Chinese history. In 1999, at the Versailles Peace Conference, a feeble China was forced to accept the decisions of the big powers. China was on the winning side, but the settlement went against their interests. This caused Peking University students to demonstrate in protest, launching a nationalist movement to modernize and revive the country. And this was a seminal moment in modern Chinese history. This zero-sum dynamic makes it very hard to construct an agreement that is politically acceptable to both parties. But ultimately, it is in the interests of both the US and China to reach such an accommodation and to persuade their domestic publics to accept it. They both need to keep their relationship steady so that both can focus on their respective pressing domestic priorities and not be distracted by troubled relations with the other.
We'll step away from Prime Minister Hsien Loong's keynote address at the Shangri-La Dialogue. Prime Minister Lee spoke on the ongoing trade tensions between the world's two largest economies, saying, and I quote, "The bottom line is that the US and China need to work together and with other countries too."
He also raised concerns of hardening the attitudes in the US and China. We will bring you full coverage of his address in Singapore tonight.